I caught my son-in-law standing over my wife's wheelchair, working a screwdriver into the brake mechanism, while the rehearsal dinner crowd laughed 20 feet away. My own daughter stood beside him, holding a napkin up to block anyone's view. I didn't yell. I didn't cause a scene. I handled it the way a man who spent 38 years as a master electrician handles a live wire mislabeled as dead. I stepped back into the dark, and I watched. Hours later, when my wife rolled herself toward the head table in front of 200 guests, the wheel locked, the frame buckled, and the chair pitched forward exactly the way it was built to. But to understand how my daughter's engagement party became the worst night of her fiancé's life, you need to know what happened 1 hour before the caterers even opened the doors. My name is Walter Hensley. I'm 66, and I spent nearly 4 decades wiring commercial buildings before I retired. I know the difference between a frayed wire and a fresh cut. I know what sabotage looks like, because I've spent my career walking into buildings after something's gone wrong and figuring out whether it was an accident or a decision. That night in the ballroom of the Whitmore Hotel, I found out it was a decision. It was 6 weeks before my daughter Renee's wedding, and we were hosting the engagement party, the meet-the-family event her fiancé's parents insisted on. I paid for half of it myself, because Renee wanted it perfect, and after everything my wife Diane had been through, I wanted her to have one night where she didn't have to worry about anything. Diane had suffered a spinal injury 11 months earlier, a fall down our back porch steps that shattered 2 vertebrae and left her partially paralyzed. She needed a wheelchair now, a custom one we'd spent nearly $9,000 getting right. She hated needing it. She'd run a flower shop for 30 years on her feet, and having to be pushed into a room instead of walking into it on her own had broken something in her the accident itself hadn't managed to touch. I arrived early to check the audio setup. The ballroom was empty except for catering staff finishing centerpieces. I walked in through the side entrance, out of habit, and that's when I heard voices near the head table. Low, careful, the way people talk when they think no one's listening. It was Preston, Renee's fiancé, crouched beside Diane's new chair, the chrome-finished one she'd been so excited to use because it finally looked like something she'd have picked out herself. He had a screwdriver in his hand, working it into the housing where the wheel lock mechanism sat. Beside him, holding a folded napkin like she was shielding something, stood my daughter. I stopped in the shadow of the drapery. Preston muttered something, and Renee, my Renee, leaned down and said, "Just make sure it happens during the toast, not before. I want everyone watching." For a second I told myself I'd misheard her. Then Preston straightened, wiped his hands on his slacks and said, "It'll look completely natural. Wheelchair frame gives out. Everyone rushes to help, and nobody's looking at the guest list when your dad has to explain why he spent Renee's whole trust fund fixing up a woman who can't even walk down the aisle at her own daughter's wedding." I stepped out from behind the drapery. What exactly is going on here? Renee's face went white. Preston barely flinched. "Walter," he said, easy and apologetic, the same smile he used on waiters and valets. "You scared us." Renee noticed a wheel squeaking, didn't want it embarrassing her mom. I used to fix bikes in high school. It was a good lie, but I'd spent 38 years learning the difference between what a wire is supposed to do and what somebody wants it to do. I looked at the housing and saw exactly what he'd done. Shaved down the pin that kept the wheel lock engaged, just enough to hold under light pressure and give out completely the moment real weight came down. The kind of weight a woman puts on a wheel lock when she's leaning forward to hug someone or reach for a microphone. I looked at my daughter. She wouldn't meet my eyes. The urge to grab Preston by his collar was almost overwhelming, but something colder took over. The same instinct that once kept me from screaming at a contractor who'd capped a gas line with electrical tape instead of a proper fitting. If I exploded, they'd deny everything, and I'd be the unhinged father who ruined the party over a squeaky wheel. I needed them to believe they'd gotten away with it. I needed proof. So I smiled back. "I appreciate you looking out for her," I said, forcing warmth into my voice. "It means a lot you two thought of it." Preston's shoulders dropped with relief. Renee exhaled like she'd been holding her breath since I walked in. "Of course, Walter," Preston said. "We just want tonight to go perfectly for her." "It will," I said, and I meant it, just not the way he thought. I walked away, found a quiet corner near the kitchen, and pulled up the venue's security app on my phone. The Whitmore had cameras covering the head table for liability reasons. I watched the footage in real time, Preston's hands working the screwdriver, Renee standing guard with the napkin. I saved it, sent it to myself twice, once by email, once to a cloud folder Diane didn't know existed, the same folder where I'd once kept photographs of code violations before a lawsuit. Then I did what any man who spends his life fixing things does when he finds something broken on purpose. I didn't throw it away. I fixed it my way. I found the venue's maintenance closet and located a replacement wheel lock housing identical to the one on Diane's chair, sitting in a bin of spare hardware the hotel kept for its own house wheelchairs. It took me 11 minutes with tools I always carry in my truck. I swapped the sabotaged housing out entirely, restored the lock to full strength, and tested it 3 times myself, putting my full weight against the frame, the way a woman leaning hard for balance would. It held, perfectly. Then I took the housing Preston had tampered with, the one with the shaved pin, and walked it over to a folding chair from the venue's overflow seating. I checked the seating chart Renee had emailed me. Preston had specifically requested a chair close to the small platform where the toasts would be given, close to the microphone. I fitted the sabotaged mechanism onto that chair's leg brace, using aircraft cable and a locking pin, the same way I'd once rigged temporary scaffolding to hold weight for exactly one event and not a minute longer. It didn't need to be elegant. It needed to hold just long enough, then fail completely the instant a groom-to-be leaned his full weight against it to steady himself while reaching for a microphone. I put the chair back exactly where the diagram said it should go. The room filled an hour later. Diane arrived on my arm, using her walker for the short distance from the car, wearing a dress the color of the delphiniums she used to grow behind our old shop. I settled her into her wheelchair myself, checking the lock under the guise of adjusting her position, feeling it click solidly into place. She had no idea what I'd found. I couldn't tell her yet, not until I knew how this would play out, because I needed her reaction, when it came, to be real. Guests filled the ballroom. Preston's parents worked the room with the easy confidence of people who'd never had to wonder whether their child loved them for the right reasons. Renee sat beside Preston, glancing occasionally toward her mother's chair with an expression that wasn't quite guilt, something closer to anticipation. At one point, I watched Preston lean toward his cousin Chase and murmur something. Chase glanced toward Diane's chair and quickly looked away. At least one other person in that room knew what was supposed to happen. The coordinator tapped a glass, and the toasts began. Preston's father spoke first, warm and forgettable. Then it was Preston's turn. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the platform, past the overflow chairs, and, exactly the way I'd watched him do at 3 other events, reached out and braced his hand against the back of the nearest chair to steady himself as he stepped up. A habit, a tick. The kind of unconscious gesture a man repeats 100 times without noticing, right up until the one time it matters. The chair gave out instantly. The leg brace folded sideways with a crack loud enough to make half the room flinch, and Preston, already leaning his full weight into that unconscious brace, lurched forward with nothing to catch him. He went down hard against the platform's edge, his shoulder catching the corner of the dessert table, sending the 3-tier engagement cake sliding onto the floor in a spray of buttercream and shattered fondant. He landed flat on his back in the wreckage, his microphone skittering away with a shriek of feedback that cut through the stunned silence of 200 guests. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Then Chase, 3 drinks deep, let out a short bark of a laugh he immediately tried to swallow. Too late. Heads turned toward him with confusion that would curdle into something colder within the hour. Renee shot up, reaching for her own chair to push it back. Pure, uncomplicated panic, since I'd never touched her chair at all, and caught her heel in her dress hem, going down hard onto one knee, tearing the seam at her shoulder, crying out in a way that had nothing manufactured about it. The room exploded into motion. Guests standing, someone calling for a doctor, Preston's mother shrieking his name, waiters rushing in. In the middle of it, my wife sat perfectly still in her wheelchair, hand pressed to her mouth, watching with genuine, uncomprehending shock, because unlike me, she still believed this was simply an accident. I did not move to help Preston up. I let his own father do that. Instead, I walked to the sound table where the coordinator kept the house laptop connected to the overhead screen, and I plugged in a flash drive I'd prepared an hour earlier. The slideshow of Renee and Preston's photos cut away, and the screen filled instead with silent security footage. Preston crouched at Diane's wheelchair with a screwdriver, Renee standing guard, and audio I'd synced from my own phone. Her voice, clear as anything, saying, "Just make sure it happens during the toast, not before. I want everyone watching." I let it play 11 seconds before I picked up the fallen microphone. I didn't raise my voice. I've never needed to. 38 years on job sites taught me a calm voice in a silent room carries further than any shout. "I found this an hour ago," I said, rigging my wife's wheelchair to fail during her own daughter's toast tonight. "I want everyone here to understand exactly what almost happened, and to whom, and why." I looked at Diane as I said it and watched her face change, shock giving way, in slow and terrible stages, to a comprehension no parent should have to witness in real time, watching her own daughter's guilt confirmed on a 12-foot screen in front of 200 people. Renee did not deny it. She could not. The footage was already looping a second time. Preston, still sitting in the cake wreckage, had gone the color of old drywall. I want to tell you the room erupted into chaos. Some of that is true. But mostly, in my memory, it's quiet. The kind of thick, suffocating quiet that falls over a job site right after someone realizes how close they came to something unrecoverable. Preston's mother spoke first, and what she said wasn't a defense of her son. It was a single, broken, "Preston, what did you do?" The way she said it told me she already knew the answer. I'll spare you most of what followed, because fallout, once it starts, moves on its own momentum, the way a structure comes down, once you've pulled the one support beam holding the rest of the weight. Renee didn't speak to me for 19 days. When she finally called, it wasn't to apologize, it was to ask, in a voice thin with fury and shame, how I could have set them up like that, as though the trap I'd built was somehow a greater betrayal than the one she'd built first. I told her the truth. I hadn't set anyone up. I'd simply refused to let her finish what she started, and let it land exactly where she'd aimed it. She hung up. It would be 4 more months before she called again. A different call entirely, one that began in silence, then crying, then eventually the beginning of something like the truth. Because once Preston understood there'd be no quiet cover-up, no family closing ranks to protect appearances, his own carefully built life started coming apart, at a pace that had nothing to do with me. It turned out Preston had been running a private line of credit for 2 years under Renee's name, without her full understanding of the terms, using her modest trust fund as collateral for real estate investments that had already gone underwater. The wheelchair scheme hadn't been cruelty for its own sake. It had been strategy. He needed Diane discredited and humiliated, needed the story to become Walter's unstable, overspending family embarrasses itself. Because he was 3 weeks from needing Renee to co-sign a loan that would have left her personally liable for debts north of $400,000. Renee broke off the engagement 11 days after her lawyer uncovered it. Preston's family spent the following weeks quietly distancing themselves from the wreckage of his finances, and within 4 months Preston had moved out of state, with lawsuits from at least 2 investors he'd misled following him there. Chase came to see me 3 weeks after the party, sober this time, and told me he'd known beforehand. Preston had bragged about it, called it harmless, a joke to put the old man in his place. Chase said nothing until he watched it happen and heard my wife's name attached to it on a security screen. He gave a statement to Renee's lawyer without being asked. It didn't undo his silence, but I respected that he showed up to say so out loud. Diane's recovery in the year that followed surprised even her doctors. Something about watching the truth land exactly where it belonged that night loosened a knot in her no physical therapist had managed to untie. 6 months later, at a small dinner Renee organized to formally apologize to her mother, Diane walked the length of the restaurant on her own 2 feet, cane in hand, chair left behind at home. I watched my daughter cry the way I hadn't seen since she was a little girl, not performing for an audience this time, just quietly devastated by what she'd almost let happen to the woman who raised her. Renee and I are rebuilding something now. It isn't finished, and I don't know that it ever fully will be. You don't unlearn, as a father, The sound of your own daughter's voice asking someone to make sure an accident happens during the toast so everyone will be watching. But she calls every Sunday now. She's back in school finishing the degree she'd put on hold for a wedding that never happened. Last month she asked if she could take her mother dress shopping, just the two of them, no occasion at all. Diane and I still have our house, the one with the back porch steps that started all of this, 11 months before any of it needed to become a lesson about who deserves your trust. We still take our evening walk most nights, her hand on my arm instead of a walker these days, moving slower than we used to, but moving all the same, past the flower beds she started tending again for the first time since the accident. People ask me sometimes whether I feel guilty about what happened to Preston, about the cake, the fall, a man's whole engineered life coming apart on camera in front of everyone he was trying to impress. I don't, not for a second. I didn't build that trap. I only refuse to let it be sprung on the one person in that room who never deserved it in the first place. If somebody in your life is quietly working on something they don't want you to see, pay attention to what they build. Pay attention to who they ask to stand guard while they do it. And if you ever find the wire already cut, waiting for someone to lean on it, don't just tape it back together and walk away pretending you didn't see. Sometimes the kindest, most protective thing a father can do is let the trap do exactly what it was built to do, and simply make sure it finds the person who built it instead.